Assalamu alaikum and hello everyone. I'm your host, Hena Zaberi, and welcome back to another episode of Justice for All Now. Thank you for joining us on Muslim Network TV, America's only Muslim-focused network. You can always watch us 24/7 on Galaxy 19, Roku TV, Apple TV, and Amazon Fire TV. Today's show is another episode in our series, Women in Justice. And my guest today is someone you may have seen before standing up for women's rights, Muslim rights on TV, or shutting down haters on Twitter. Zahra Billoo is a civil rights lawyer and executive director of the oldest chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations, CARE, which is located, her chapter is located in San Francisco, the Bay Area. She's led the organization through a period of six-fold growth. Today, she manages one of the largest CARE offices in the country with a team of civil rights and social justice advocates dedicated to the empowerment of American Muslims through legal services, legislative advocacy, and community organizing. I'm so happy to have Zahra on here today. Thank you so much for joining us, Zahra.
Of course. Thanks so much for having me, Hina. Assalamu alaikum. Jazakallah khair for the work that you're doing here with this show. And also, always, it's nice to be in conversation rather than on a Facebook thread.
Yes, definitely. So, Zahra, this show is dedicated to women in justice who have done the hard work of actual grassroots advocacy, organizing, have really built their career, not just on social media posts or, that 15 minutes of fame, but real hardcore grassroots work. And so for that, I'm really grateful that you're here because you're an example of that. Now, and the show is about you. We want our audience to know more about the person who is Zahra Billoo.
No pressure.
So tell me more about where did you grow up? Where were you born? And where did you go to school?
Sure. And I should say this is a random tangential note. This camera app is flipping. So like I'll adjust my right arm, but it'll look my left on the screen. And so if I look confused at times and you're like, what side of her hijab is she adjusting? That's what's happening. So I grew up in Southern California. My parents have been there since 1982. That's, we've literally lived in the same exact place since 1982 as well. Really privileged to have had, parents who moved to the United States to seek out financial opportunities that were available to them, which is not something that is accessible to a lot of immigrants and wasn't accessible to a lot of people, even in our family later on, just in terms of people who came a few years later. They raised us as a mosque-going family. So we went to the masjid, gosh, it was like 6 days a week. I think that we used to sometimes get Sundays off. And they said as middle class working as they were, that we couldn't always go to Pakistan. I think I've only ever been 3 times. And so my connection to my culture is less deep than my connection to my religion, with Sundays for Sunday school, Monday through Thursday for Quran class, Friday for community events. And so they raised us with really an American Muslim identity first and foremost. At that time, we were the only practicing Muslim kids in our public school, my brother and I. And so that meant that I was the only one who was wearing a hijab, and my brother would fast when he was playing basketball on the school team. Mm-hmm. And it was, incredible to know that our parents chose Islam when they came to the United States, that they went from being Muslim because everybody around them is Muslim, to being Muslim because they want to, and they feel like they can, and they're making that choice, and they're being intentional about raising us that way. You'll notice I haven't stopped to take a breath until just now, which is also, by the way, how my family knew that I would be a lawyer. They were like, she talks so much. Yeah, that's probably the career for her. She talks, she's argumentative, she wants to debate, let's send her to law school. And so we knew through my childhood that, we were Pakistani, that we were intentionally practicing and devout Muslims. And Zahra was on a path to become a lawyer. But that's really how it started, is what I would say.
So what was your first job out of college?
Oh my gosh. Well, I started working when I was 18 or 19, actually at the company that my dad worked at before out of college, because I was one of those kids that thought that I would gain my independence if I started working early. And really what I should have done is just be really grateful that my parents could support me at that time, which is, again, just something that we were really privileged to have, and enjoyed my youth. But I was like, no, I want to do it all. I want to be involved on my college campus, and I want to work off campus. And so I was working at a company that my dad was working at. But I also worked on campus. I worked with the student union, which is not the student union. I worked at the student union on campus, but I also worked with the faculty union, which is actually where I got some of my earliest training in organizing, right? Working with professors who were dealing with university tuition increases, but also salary decreases, hiring freezes, things of that sort. And understanding that it was going to take every tool in the toolbox, that we needed to be inside the chancellor's office advocating for what we wanted, but we also needed to support the protesters outside. And that it wasn't just about a one-off organizing moment, but rather about ongoing organizing and ongoing communication with people who could help and people who were impacted. And a lot of it was just around education, right? Is that people didn't realize how so much of this would impact them and why they should care. So those are some of my jobs before I finished college. I went straight from college to law school. And so my first job after law school, like my first full-time job, was actually at CARE. So I've been here since the week after the California bar exam in 2009, going on over 11 years now.
Wow. That's dedication, mashallah. So we often see you as a very, like, you have a strong persona, especially on television. Is that the real Zahra, or is there another side of Zahra that a lot of us don't know about?
I've thought a lot over the years about how leadership in our society, so more broadly than the Muslim community even, is very assertive and bold and loud and strong. It's all of these things. But we very rarely see like soft leaders or vulnerable leaders. And if I were to be really simplistic, you could even say that we see a lot of masculine traits in leadership, but not very many feminine ones. And so over the years, I've had to grapple with, I was socialized as a leader in male-dominated spaces, and still very much work in male-dominated spaces. But sometimes I just need to like cry. Sometimes there is strength in showing my vulnerability, and sometimes there is privacy in preserving that vulnerability. And so I would say that for any leader that you see, and I use the word leader sort of generally, but for any leader or persona, person in a position that you see on social media, on television, in writing, know that that's only one facet of them. You wouldn't know this if you just saw my television appearances or the work that I do at CARE, but like I go home every day and I play with my 2 kittens, Justice and Peace, right? And it's chasing them around with treats or picking them up and cuddling with them, that gives me sometimes a rejuvenation I need to keep coming back into the work of challenging Islamophobia. But you wouldn't know that. And so whenever you see people publicly, know that you're only seeing a part of them. And you're only seeing a part of them at a point in time, right? So even like as I get comfortable with being vulnerable, that's something that I've been working on over the last few years. It's not what you would have seen 5 years ago at all publicly.
Especially when you're up and coming, that there isn't that space to be vulnerable, because then you get walked over, and
it's perceived as weakness, right? It's perceived as weakness. It's treated as weakness at times, and that I think has a lot to do with, again, just how more broadly we are socialized. And I think women sit in this real tension of, we need to demonstrate certain, again, for lack of better words, arguably like masculine leadership qualities. And if we don't, we get walked over. And by the way, if we do, then people complain that we're too strong. And so there's this like, right, no matter what you do. And so the best, most effective thing to do, I would argue, is to be ourselves.
Zahra does, and those of you who may follow her on social media would know this, but others may not know. Zahra bakes birthday cakes for foster children through Cakes for Kids, and coordinates a monthly homeless feeding effort. And you've been doing this consistently. This is not something that you do once in a while. How have you kept consistent with this, with everything else that you do?
I think you're being generous when you say consistently. Consistently is a very broad term here, right? So with the Cake for Kids, for example, I haven't baked at all for the charity in the pandemic, in part because it was shut down for a while. But I do take joy in baking. And so that's actually how that came about, is that let me take a step back. I take joy in eating dessert. And related to that, I sometimes make dessert. And the problem is if I make it, then I eat it. And so I have to give it away. And so many, many years ago, a friend told me about a group called Cake for Kids, and they have now chapters in different parts of California. I think may also be expanding in other places. And it's a model that can be replicated, which is to say, one of the things that we take for granted is that people care about us on our birthdays. Now, we could have a longer conversation about whether we should celebrate birthdays or not, but many people do, and many people are cared for on their birthdays or take care of themselves or have the resources to do those types of things. But for children in foster care, that's something sometimes an overlooked treat. And so what Cake for Kids does is they pair bakers with families and say, okay, families or service providers, and say, okay, like it's this kid's birthday. This is how old they'll turn. Can you make them this kind of cake? And so, yeah, I wish I'd have been able to do it more this year, but the pandemic has really made that challenging. The same is true for Project Feed, which is to say that we have not had any events in the pandemic, but that is similarly a project that we started, more than 12 years ago. I remember it was a conversation that my friend Fiza Ahmed and I were having in Ramadan. We were like all sitting around being like, what are we going to have for iftar tonight? And she said, the point of Ramadan isn't to plan our iftars, right? Like it's to actually reduce our dependence on food, reduce our indulgences, develop discipline around those things. What can we do to help our neighbors who are fasting, not out of choice, but out of necessity? We were living in at the time in downtown San Francisco where the disparity between the wealthy and the poor is very stark. And, many, many parts of San Francisco, even then, but so much worse now, you'll find unhoused people living on the streets, large encampments with no relief in sight. And so it started in our other friend, Sophia Saeed's apartment. We made, I think, a couple of dozen peanut butter jelly sandwiches and gave them out the next day. And over the years, that grew to a monthly event where we were making hundreds of meals and lots of people were coming. And to your original question about consistency, it's hard. Like I don't want to tell people that it's easy to do all things related to service all the time. We have to take breaks. We have to surround ourselves with friends who care about the same issues. And we have to be compassionate with ourselves when we fall off. So if I can't make it 1 month, or this week was difficult and so I couldn't do the thing that I committed to, I apologize, I make up for it. But I also know that next week is a new week, or next month is a new month. And so I keep trying. It's a work in progress, like all things faith.
When this work is hard, it's hard from so many aspects. But all of us are in it for something. And it's different things that inspire different people. What has been something that has, and I don't mean this in a very cliched way, but it may be a cliche, because sometimes that's all you need is sometimes it's just something you see on the street, or it could be a quote that you read, or a verse of the Quran that were pondering on. But what has, in moments of difficulty, in times where the work is really tough, has kept inspired you to keep going?
I think at some point between, I was a teenager with a lot of angst about what I didn't have, right? I didn't live in a big house. I didn't have my own nice car. Like there were things I didn't have. I couldn't go to Pakistan every year the way lots of my family members did. And so that was a lot of how I felt in my teenage years. But I think it's the experience, for me at least, between, I would say, 17 and 20, where I'm coming to terms with how privileged I am. I mean, I've got US citizenship when other Muslims are fearful of deportation after 9/11. I speak English when others are being made fun of for not speaking English. I have a roof over my head and food and supportive parents. And so there was a period in time where I was like, I don't have all of these things because I'm better or special, or even necessarily because I earned them. Rather, Allah has entrusted them to me. And so the question that I come back to is, what am I doing with what I've been entrusted with? And this comes up when I think about Cake for Kids, right? I have access to all of the dessert I want, the dessert of my choice, the dessert that's good for me, the dessert that's bad for me, the dessert I can make, the dessert my friends buy, and so on. I mean, today, my friends and I are having a conversation about this new cupcake flavor at a local bakery and how we want to try that, but that's, why me? And so what am I going to do to share that privilege? The same is true for the food and our neighbors in terms of people who are unhoused and don't know where their next meal is coming from. I don't cook, and yet, alhamdulillah, I always know where my next meal is coming from. Like, I've never been in a situation where I've said, oh, like, I don't know if I can afford my next meal, or I don't know that I'll be able to access my next meal. And so what am I going to do with that privilege? And, and that extends to what I do around civil rights and legal services. I'm a lawyer. Yes, I work to get my law degree, but access to law school, the ability to pay for law school, to pay off those loans, to any of that, right? Like, all of that was a blessing from Allah. And so what am I going to do to help others with it? My mom always told us when we were younger that, one of the challenges about being privileged and having resources is that we're held to account for everything that we did for them. Mm-hmm. And for me, the opportunity there is also that I might be able to do something good with what I was given. And through that, inshallah, I will be increased in this life and the next. And so that's, for me, the thread. And it's like, I try to be really consistent about it. Even when I think about my mental health, right, is access to a therapist, access to awareness about my wellness and when I'm struggling and what I need are privileges that I have, but others may not. And so how do I do the best that I can with them?
Let's talk about some of the, the cases that have, through your career. One of the first ones that I remember was, and I don't remember the young man's name, but it was his car that was being tracked.
Yeah.
So tell us more about that case and tell me why you're laughing.
It's such a funny story. I think it's funny because, like, no matter how many times I've told it, and now it's been 10 years, it always sounds so outlandish every time, right? And so it was Yasser Afifi. He, I believe at the time, was 19 or 20 years old. It was the fall of 2010. Mm-hmm. And a day or two before I met him, I had seen an article online. I think it might have been on Reddit or Gizmodo or one of these like tech sites that existed even back then, about someone who'd found a GPS tracking device on their car. And, it's like the law enforcement must have placed it there, and then they came to get it. And I was like, what is this? Like, it sounds like it's out of a movie. Like, what do you mean they put it on the car and then they came to get it back? Like, and I didn't connect the dots that it was, I don't know if the original post didn't identify him as an Arab male from my community, but a day or two later, he came to us at CARE and he said, look, I took my car in for an oil change. We looked under the car. We found a device and a battery pack under the car. And, we posted pictures of it online. The other people on the internet helped us determine that it was a GPS tracking device, that the type of device is the kind that's used by law enforcement. And, within a day or so of us posting that on the internet and getting those answers, the FBI showed up outside my apartment, pulled me over, said they wanted to ask me a few questions, and then told me that the device was theirs and that I needed to give it back to them. And if I didn't, that there would be consequences. And I was like, what? It's which FBI agent, and this is 2010. I mean, definitely don't do this in 2020 if you're an FBI agent that's listening. Which FBI agent does this and thinks that it's not going to go viral? Like, someone showed up at my door and said, give me the tracking device back. Anyways. And so, my first reaction was sort of shock and disbelief, but this was someone who was from the community, I actually knew the mechanic also. It was my mechanic. And so there was another level of verification there. And then, of course, one of the things that we do at CARE, one of the first things that we do at CARE actually, is if you call us and you say that the FBI has visited you, we say, okay, well, give us the FBI agent's contact information. And if you agree to have us represent you, then we'll call the FBI and we'll say, I represent so-and-so. They're my client. What do you want from them? Mm-hmm. So I did all that with them, you know, and then we went through the process of requesting his files, and you know, the FBI essentially confirmed that all of this was true.
And this is a time where our community was a bit naive then. we're a little bit better than, you know.
We were naive and we were hopeful because we had President Barack Hussein Obama, right? Hope and change and the secret Muslim. And so things must be getting better. And so I think that we are a lot more savvy now around our interactions with law enforcement. And that continues to be, by the way, a point of growth and evolution, particularly for the immigrant segment of the Muslim community. Black Muslims have understood law enforcement's intention and purpose from its origination, but immigrant Muslims, South Asians and Arabs in particular, I think have been naive and optimistic about this. But it continues to get better, right? So by 2010, we're confronting the FBI. In 2020, we're now having conversations about budget justice and defund the police. And
it's
like
saying, different paradigm. So it's like, you know, sometimes when you listen to that and you're like, that, you know, remember, I remember this as well, your Facebook header. And I remember this because at that time, I didn't know you as a justice act. I knew you as my sister's Facebook friend. So, and I remember your header said radical, and just that, you know, do you remember that?
I don't, but that sounds like something I would have put up. Yes.
Right. So that, you know, just things have changed so much in this decade. Mm-hmm. And this case came around in you know, I'm, you know, from Los Angeles, Southern California as well, where we had you know, people surveilling our community, you know, and our masajid handing over people to the FBI saying this guy is spying or, you know, talking nonsense in the mosque. And I remember not being able to leave my keys behind because our board members would be like, Sister Hannah, why do you keep leaving your keys behind? Like, what is wrong with you? Don't you know that's one of the tactics of people who spy on mosques? And I'm like, you know, so.
You're like me, you're from Southern California, where around the same time, Craig Monte was spying on the masjid in Irvine and other Orange County masjid, and that's what he was doing, right? That's, I think, where that lesson comes from, is he would leave his keys laying around, and it was a recording device. And, you know, while he was doing that, law enforcement was saying to members of the Muslim community, we're not spying on you. We want to build relations with you. And we only found out because of him.
How do you feel now when we're, especially under this pandemic, but even before the pandemic, where we are now broadcasting everything that is happening in the mosques on our Facebook pages? Things have changed so much since, like, all the khutbahs are broadcasted. Every event that happens in the masjid is broadcasted. Even so, our religious life has become super public.
Yes, and as a free speech advocate, I think that that's great, because I don't want the community to cower or hide because of fear of surveillance, right? Mm-hmm. So, and that's been my position for more than 10 years. It's why I've been tweeting for so long, to be like, I'm going to tell you as much as I'm going to tell you. At the same time, I worry about two things. One is government surveillance hasn't gone away. It's just evolved. So we're looking now at facial recognition technology, right? We're looking at constantly how local police collaborate with federal agencies and what information is shared there. And so their surveillance mechanisms are evolving in some ways and times faster than our controls on them, or even our awareness of them. I mean, part of what's funny about Yasser's story is the idea, even in 2010, of placing a tracking device, right? Like, I'm going to hold up my iPhone 10. This is, you know, I believe it was a little bit bigger than this phone. Mm-hmm. Even then, the idea of placing a device of that size on his car with a battery pack sounded outlandish, because it was just in the next year or two that we learned that the cell phone companies were handing over geo-tracking data, right? Mm-hmm. And you didn't need to attach anything, because you would just go to AT&T with a warrant and get that information. And so their methods evolve faster than our awareness of the methods, which is terrifying, and something that we need to be incredibly vigilant about. The other thing I worry about, Hina, is It would be interesting to compare religious programming today to religious programming in 1999.
Mm.
And in some ways, I am certain that the programming has grown for the better, right? So it's more inclusive of women, it's more inclusive of minorities, it's more responsive to mental health concerns, right? There is also, in some ways, broadly speaking, more civic engagement conversation happening in religious programming. But is it as revolutionary? Is it as rebellious? Is it as, for lack of better words, is it as radical? Or have those conversations become more moderate,
Mm.
more, responsible, to use quotes, right? Like, and I do worry sincerely that because of the fear that was instilled in our community and continues to be instilled in our community, right? Like if you speak out too much for Palestine, if you speak out too much for X, if you speak out too much for Kashmir or the Uyghurs, or, or you criticize the US military, right? Like you organize civil disobedience, whatever those things are, then you will get arrested, you will get targeted, you will get surveilled. And so I would be, and I don't know that anyone's done it, but as someone who was attending religious programming then and attends it today, I find today's religious programming, again, to be better in so many ways, but possibly falling short when it comes to the necessary vehemence for challenging injustice.
Exactly. The stories of the prophets as they were facing oppressors have been muted, edited.
Right.
What the word, even the word jihad has been,
Right.
We don't use it anymore. So
Right. We don't use the word jihad anymore. We can't have an honest discussion about armed struggle when it comes to self-defense. Like there's a number of places where we're falling short. Like I do still remember, for example, when Hamas was elected to the government in Palestine. It was already at that time hush hush to be like, no, we don't talk about Hamas. And it doesn't matter that they were democratically elected. We can't talk about them because they are they've been labeled a terrorist group and we don't want to get in trouble. And so those kinds of things, I think, over the years continue to have an impact. And it's not, by the way, exclusive to the Muslim community. So I don't know if you saw, or exclusive to the immigrant Muslim community, but yesterday, I believe it was, at the Department of Justice, labeled a number of jurisdictions.
Seattle and Portland
Right?
and New York City.
But did you see the rationale that they applied? So as part of its rationale for labeling the cities, I have this quote from NBC that I posted. So the Justice Department cited city councils voting to cut police funding, the refusal to prosecute protesters on charges like disorderly conduct and unlawful assembly, arguably nonviolent charges, the rejection of federal intervention. So we don't want our police to collaborate with ICE or the military or anything like that. And then lastly, injuries suffered by law enforcement officials during violent outbursts. So that last one is the only one that actually addresses violence. And of course, even that one is tricky because in many cases, it's law enforcement that initiates violence. But even if you take out that criteria, like, okay, defunding the police, not charging nonviolent protesters, and then rejecting federal intervention, all of a sudden you're an anarchist jurisdiction.
Yes.
And you've got, and what is that intended to do? To create fear and intimidation around those cities. And so the immigrant segments of the Muslim community, I think, continue to have opportunities to learn from civil rights and anti-war activists across the country who are Muslim and not, because what the government does to us, they are for sure doing to others.
Definitely. I wanted to, you talked about Palestine, and that leads me to the Women's March. What happened there?
So I laugh because I was actually thinking about the Women's March this week when there was a Supreme Court vacancy last, and Justice Kavanaugh was up for a nomination. I had gone to DC briefly to participate in the Women's March organizing to protest his nomination. And I was just thinking this morning, who is going to organize to protest the Republican attempt to fill the vacancy right now that isn't the Women's March, and more broadly, that isn't progressive except Palestine, because I want to go, and this matters and will affect us for a long time. A majority conservative Supreme Court is not something that ends when Donald Trump's tenure ends. It will be with us through the rest of our lives. And so I laugh because of that. But the Women's March, we were nearing the end of 2016, and the Women's March had come into being. And I'd been talking to our friend and sister, Linda, about the march organizing for the beginning of 2017. I had already made plans, actually, to go to DC to protest the inauguration. Like that I knew I wanted to do. And then the Women's March came up. And so I was like, okay, I'll stay the extra day and participate in that. And so, as Linda worked to ensure Muslim inclusion in the inaugural Women's March, I was invited to speak. And it was one of the most humbling and exhilarating experiences ever to speak before hundreds of thousands, close to 1 million, I believe, maybe even more, but one of the largest protests in US history, right? To speak to that audience as a proud Muslim woman about all of the things that matter to us in that moment. And from then on, I stayed engaged with the Women's March. In 2018, I spoke at a local march. In 2019, I spoke at a local march. I went to DC to protest Justice Kavanaugh's nomination with the Women's March. I was involved in the conventions. I helped co-develop parts of the policy platform that the Women's March had advanced in their first chapter. And so come what year are we in now? Someone joked the other day, we don't have Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday in COVID. We just have Blur's Day. It's all Blur's Day. But come 2019, the founders of the Women's March, Carmen, Tamika, Bob, and Linda, put together a transition plan in which they would hand off the organization to a new board of leaders while still maintaining one seat for the founders on the board. And so, I was invited to apply. I applied. I was vetted by a nomination committee, and I was invited to join the board in the summer of 2019. Now, the board of the Women's March and the Women's March in general, of course, had gone through a very tumultuous period in their entire first 3 years. They were so successful in their organizing. They did distributed marches across the country. They organized some of the largest mobilizations. They organized the Women's Convention, which is where the picture in that article was from. They were doing so much, but they were coming under vehement attack by Zionists who were upset that Linda and others were advocating for Palestine, by the right wing who were upset that the Women's March was mobilizing opposition to Donald Trump, by white women who were problematically pushing the question of, will you condemn the Nation of Islam? And that's a longer conversation that I think is really important to have, but also one where it's important that we follow the lead of impacted Black communities. And so it was just intense, right? Donald Trump was going after them. His son was going after them. Fox News was going after them. And so when the time for the transition came, it was really important to the old group and the new group to say, let's do this very carefully because we know we're going to come under attack. And subhanAllah, from July to September, all we did was plan for the transition. We had never met in person. We didn't have officers. Arguably, there were already clear signs of struggling because it shouldn't take that long to announce a transition.
Exactly.
Come September, we announced a transition, and it was, just 3 really rough days. Actually, about a year ago this week, it began with what we had hoped would be a positive exclusive in the Washington Post that was marred by a headline that was false, right? The headline announcing the transition was false. It said that the Women's March had removed essentially its old leaders for allegations of anti-Semitism, which was so inaccurate because it was the old leaders who developed the transition plan. It was the old leaders who said this is part of the growth of an organization, right? And before the Women's March staff could even move fast enough to get their own statement out or, clean up the mess that was frankly created by an inadequate public relations job, and a reporter who was perceived to be friendly, but wasn't, right? Another long conversation that I think would be really great for Muslim Network to have and for Sound Vision to be thinking about is how do we train people, Muslims and otherwise, around how to navigate mainstream media? Anyways, before that could even get cleaned up, before we could even move, before the Women's March as an institution could even move to defend the founders, to say that this is a mischaracterization of what happened and we reject the assertions that they are leaving the organization because of false and baseless allegations of anti-Semitism, the right wing started to rally. And the narrative that came forward was, oh, out with one anti-Semite, in with another. And they were frankly referring to me and Linda, spreading lies about our activism, saying that, you know, our activism for Palestine was anti-Semitic, when in fact it wasn't. But we had a new board that did not have the resilience of the old board. So the old board stayed strong for 3.5 years under the most vociferous right-wing attacks. The new board, a group of 16 women and one founder, was not as strong. They immediately started to get concerned. And Hina, the things that I heard, I thought I had seen Progressive Accept Palestine, but I really hadn't until then, right? Like, how can we work on a woman's right to choose if we're always fighting about Palestine? How can I can't be Islamophobic because I'm Latin? Like, no, right, exactly, right? Maybe you should step down and let us pick another Muslim. And it was like, no, that's not how this works. Like, you don't get to at this point decide who is more palatable Muslim. And I remember the straw that broke the camel's back for me was, well, what if you step down to protect your dignity? And I was like, no. And this goes to the point I made earlier about the privileges that we have come from Allah. I was like, my privilege, my dignity doesn't come from the Women's March. In fact, it doesn't come from CARE or from my work. It comes from Allah, right? So what matters to me is that I am good with my Creator. And if you look at my track record, I have been consistent on the issue of Palestine for over a decade now. And at no point have I ever been anti-Jewish. In fact, we work closely with Jewish partners. So you can take what I've said and twist it and turn it and all of those things. There were also concerns about what I'd said about the military, and I stand by that. The military is a killing and murderous force in our country, and I pay my taxes knowing they go to the military because I myself am fearful of going to jail. And every time I pay my taxes, I choose my liberty over the liberty of people that our military is killing. And then the last example, actually really quickly, Hannah, is there were also concerns about what I'd said about law enforcement. So law enforcement in our country, the FBI in particular, as it's targeted the Muslim community, has long targeted people who are at times mentally ill, right? And they set them up in entrapment plots. And so there were concerns about how I had said that. And I was like, okay, so show me how I could say this better, how I could say it in a less ableist way. But it doesn't change that my community's lived experience is that the FBI goes and targets the guy who thinks that the Taliban would meet with him at Starbucks in broad daylight, right? And that something is not right if that's what you think. And so anyways, the long and short of it is that over 3 days, I had to make a choice of, will I resign and let them off the hook for forcing me to resign? Or will I force them to be cowards in public, right? Will I force them to say, no, we are progressive, except Palestine? Will I force them to say, we'll only work with some Muslims and not others? And so over the objection of every single founder, so every single founder had my back in this process. Over the objection of every single founder, a majority of the board, not the unanimous board, but a majority of the board voted to remove me. And by the way, the other thing that they did that was absurd was that they said that they did it, by the way, also at the behest of the chapters, which was unbelievable to those of us who had been organizing for a number of years with the Women's March, because the only chapters that had remained with the Women's March for 3.5 years were the chapters that had appreciated the radical commitment to justice that Linda and Tamika and Carmen and Bob had already demonstrated, who had withstood the right-wing attacks. And so, when they did that, I knew I needed to move really quickly. I knew that I needed to set my narrative. And I was able to do that. And I'm really blessed to have done that and to have had the support of so many people in our community and more broadly. But the biggest heartbreak amid all of it is that the Women's March was an incredible platform. And to see them turn their back.
And it's evolved, but it was their loss at the end of the day, because
our dignity doesn't come from anyone, right? Like, our dignity doesn't come from anyone. Our platforms don't come from anyone. Like, the work of justice continues with or without us. And it was I don't say this about me because I don't think it was just about me. It was about
it wasn't. I think it was that whole direction where it was going, and especially after the first march when it wasn't. And they did learn from their mistakes, and they pivoted, and especially in 2019 when they included many more grassroots, like even here in DC, the people of DC were finally given a platform, and then all of them that just went away, and it was this void, and it felt like everything that had been, people make mistakes. but you correct it if you really want to,
Right.
or if you just want to play to the safe tunes. That's not a revolution. That's not.
Well, it's not also like a broad umbrella, right? Like you're not including everyone. And we saw that at the beginning of 2020 when like people were like, do we go to the march? Do we not? Who is the Women's March now? And so the work continues, right? And inshallah will continue. And Palestine doesn't need any of us to be free, right? That is in the end Allah's decision, but we have to do our part, right? And so it was important to me to stick to my principles, to say that I wasn't going to cave, but also that if our allies, our so-called allies, were going to be cowards, they would need to do so in public, right? And that's why I didn't resign. I made them vote me off, because if I had resigned, they would have just been like, oh, we've decided to part ways. No, like I did not decide to part ways. You decided that you weren't going to step up for justice.
And again, this is a point, and we bring this up several times in this show, is when you speak about Israel, automatically it becomes about anti-Semitism. And if we don't stick to our guns, we don't make sure to differentiate between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, even within our community and outside our community, it's constant and has to be addressed. Otherwise, things like this will continue to happen.
Yeah, and I think, but here's the other thing, right? And also to clarify, and I know you're not saying this, but I think sometimes people think it. I don't see a lot of anti-Semitism in the Muslim community. I'm not going to say it doesn't exist. It exists. All sorts of bigotry exists in all communities, and the Muslim community is no exception. But I don't remember the last time I had to correct someone and be like, no, you don't mean to say Jews, you mean to say Israelis or Zionists, right? Like I don't see that happening a lot. And so does anti-Semitism exist? Yes. Is it a problem? Yes. Is it a disproportionate problem in the Muslim community? No. And by the way, when supporters of apartheid Israel, which is always how I prefer to say their name, they're not Israel, it's the apartheid Israel, right? Is that when supporters of apartheid Israel label pro-Palestine activism as anti-Semitism, what I have heard from our colleagues and allies in the Jewish community happens is that they actually water down real anti-Semitism, right? Is that if you call everything anti-Semitism, then the anti-Semites can say, well, then nothing is anti-Semitism, or they can say, oh, like they cry wolf all the time. And so it doesn't help the cause. It doesn't help the cause of Palestine to be anti-Semitic, because the issue isn't about Jews versus Muslims, it's about justice. And there are Jews and Muslims on both sides, right? There are Muslim Zionists and there are Jewish anti-Zionists. And it doesn't help the cause of anti-Semitism when we call pro-Palestine work, and not you, but when people call pro-Palestine work anti-Semitism, because then it takes away from what is actually happening on the ground with anti-Semitism, which is vile and violent, and for sure is a problem in this country.
So, as we're winding down, I can't let you go away without talking about the border protest. And
let's talk about the border protest. Okay.
Let's talk about this. I think it's important to talk about. Tell me what happened and what would you do differently?
So what happened, and I really want to focus on what happened, right? And I think we may mean different things with what happened. What happened is the United States was caging children, right? Children who were fleeing inhumane conditions in other parts of the world, because in many cases, our foreign policy and our economic policy. So these kids are coming across the border. They're being separated from their families. They're being tear gassed. They're being caged. And then they're being taken to court by themselves without representation, 2- and 3-year-olds, right? If that. They're being held in disgusting conditions and so on. And so we received a call or invitation from our interfaith partners on the border who said, we are going down there to do what we know how to do best, which is pray. Pray for the children, pray for our complicity as Americans, pray for our future. And so that's what we did. And when we talk about what happened, I want to make sure that we don't lose sight of that, is that you had hundreds of faith leaders, and I don't say this to defend myself, but also me, risking our physical safety to go down and say, this is a problem. That Allah will ask us what we did with our privilege, our US citizenship. Did we do everything we could to advocate for the humanity of these kids, to say, we know that we pay our taxes and that funds your violence, but we are not okay with this. And so, Hina, my most vivid memory of that time is honestly risking our lives near the border wall and that's getting lost in this most recent sort of social media firestorm, is we are approaching border police who have guns, who have riot gear, who are saying to us, don't be violent, and we're like praying, right? I remember being so close to a border guard, thinking he could break my face, and knowing only Allah will protect me in this moment, and really turning over my fate to him, because I knew that Allah said, like, we must advocate for justice and we must change things with our hands if we could. And so that's for me what that was. Now, in getting there, and it's funny because I actually didn't remember this until it got drudged up by a certain online troll who we know has a vendetta against some of our religious leaders and some of our Muslim organizations. But in fact, like, you know, the nature of his commentary and his questioning is anti-interfaith, anti-human rights, anti-social justice, anti-woman, and causes, by the way, a lot of us to wonder, like, who is paying your bills that you're just making all these videos all the time, attacking everyone? Like, what is it that you do and what is your objective? What I was reminded of through his online trolling was that in the process of planning for the event, we knew it would be an interfaith event. We wanted to be everybody had the intention of being as inclusive as possible, which meant that the prayers referenced God and not anyone's specific God, which meant that the actions were general in nature, that people prayed in their own languages and in their own sort of religious practices. Now, in that, there was an instance that many of us were surprised and confused by and didn't realize what was happening until it was too late, right? So they said, okay, we're doing some group prayers and we're going to do a blessing for everyone before we go out there. And we all just got in line. Nobody knew, and I can tell you because I'm the first Muslim in the line, I did not know, Hina, that one of our allies, right, someone who's been on the front lines of fighting for justice for everyone, Reverend Tracy, would put a cross on my forehead. I don't think she like understood the ramifications of doing that, right? But I remember when it happened, I was like, oh my gosh, like what do I do now? But in that moment, my intention was not to engage in kufr or shirk, right? No one's intention was.
Those are some of the accusations have been
right? Like, let's just be clear for anyone that knows me, right? Like, my religion is really important to me, as is my belief in Allah. And to say, hey, like, for everyone their own religion, but I don't need, like, what, you know, why would I intentionally sign up to have a cross put on me?
You know,
oil I didn't understand.
Exactly. Seeing those pictures, you do have a visceral reaction.
Yeah, imagine being there. Imagine being there and you're like, oh, she's going to like, we're all saying a generic prayer. Like, we're all just going to do the thing and move on, right? And like, you're more worried that there is no restroom on the beach for the next 6 hours. And you don't know what kind of violence the border guards are going to unleash on you because they've been violent to everyone else. And you get in line and something happens and you're like, okay, I don't have time to deal with this now. Allah knows it wasn't my intention, right? I will seek forgiveness and we're going to keep on moving, right? But I think that there's this like impression that this happens at every interfaith gathering. It doesn't. I've participated in many over the years, right? This doesn't happen. There's a allegation that it was intentional, to which I would say, like, you know me, right? I'm your sister, not you, but like, why would you? I'm your sister also, but our religion teaches us to give people 70 excuses, not to spread slander without asking when the visual itself confuses everything we know about it, right? But then also have some respect and understanding for the strategy of the leaders, right? Not the leaders, of visible activists, of experienced activists, to say, you can't see in the video that we were shocked and concerned, but also knew that we needed to prioritize safety in that moment. And that meant not getting into a 30-minute theological debate on the beach after something that was unplanned happened, right? But it does mean that there were conversations after.
But do these experiences like this, is there a need? And we've had these discussions several times online.
Yeah.
Is there a need for more when we are going to these spaces, when there are no set rules, for there to be some set rules, for there to be some leadership from scholarship that helps us? Because that is, you know, when we go in as faith leaders, a lot of us are not like some of the interfaith leaders that come up, they may be reverends and pastors and all of that in their own faith traditions. But a lot of times when it's Muslims, many of us are not sheikhas and sheikhs who are out there.
You know, I don't think it takes a sheikh or a sheikha to say, hey, maybe they shouldn't have put a cross on her forehead. Maybe that wouldn't have been okay. Right?
100%.
And to be fair, like the sheikhas and sheikhs, they didn't know about the libations. So I think that so there's like this like ongoing like, hey, we're continuing to learn. This country and our allies are very, very diverse. I don't think it's correct to say that there were no rules. There were rules and understandings. Now, do accidents happen? Yes. But are you telling me that some online troll would have been better situated to mitigate that accident than the incredible leaders that were already there? Not just the sheikhs and sheikhas, but also the interfaith and civil rights activists, right? Who also know how to navigate these spaces, because sometimes it's about knowledge and wisdom in the religion, and sometimes it's about knowledge and wisdom in the space. And so I say all that to say, for me, the takeaway, Hina, is that we need more Muslims in these spaces. There were hundreds of people there, maybe 24 Muslims. Imagine, right, how much more influence we'd have had on the program. Who could have maybe foreshadowed the issue arising if there were more Muslims involved in the planning? And so I regret that I was in that line and didn't know what would happen until it was too late and couldn't stop it for anyone else. Do I regret being there? No. Is there anything I could have done differently? I honestly don't even think so. Right? Like, I went there with the intention to serve Allah. And in the end, that was the most important thing I did. Were there mistakes? Yes. Did we repent? Yes. But my biggest concern out of all of this, frankly, is that people will be scared away from interfaith and human rights work. That's, by the way, the undertone of some of the online trolls who are putting forward this narrative. And that is then the impact for people who are like, I don't want to be attacked. I don't want viral images of me taken out of context and spread online, because that's what I've been dealing with for a week, is that this, and it's never comfortable to be in a visible position, but it is the risk that we take. And frankly, if more of us took it, then I think our collective advancement, our collective ability to say, the Muslims will lead this protest, or this is how we will be most inclusive, or hey, maybe let's not do that thing that nobody knew was happening because we saw it coming. That is where we need to be going. And to anyone that would spread slander about fellow Muslims engaging in kufr and shirk without asking for more context, without asking for more clarification, and without assuming the best of our brothers and sisters, their justice is with Allah.
Well, that's, and this is part of life. There are going to be, gusts of winds that come and knock you over. And then you ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the strength to keep going. And that is what makes us humans. Mistakes are humans. And moving forward is Allah loves tawbah. This is something a part of our faith as well. But it seems like that sort of the aspect of tawbah has totally been washed out in all of this. Yes, it's. We could have an hour-long discussion on this. Like, that is what from and what I get out of this is that, at least, especially for the younger people who are getting involved in this work, it is so important to actually have these discussions.
But the really quick clarification I want to make is, I don't think that the aspect of Tawbah is lost, because I don't know a Muslim who participated that wasn't like, that shouldn't have happened, right?
No, I know you all. I meant in the online space. Like, that is
lost is, this person said they're going to do Tawbah, and I'm not going to accept that. I'm going to keep fighting them. Right?
But they're not God, so
exactly.
I have to love for that. Alhamdulillah. So, this, we're down to the hour where we need to go now, but this is something that it's a learning process, and we're going through this. And this is the first generation of immigrant Muslims who are part of this. Black Muslims have been a part of this, and maybe we need to be learning more from them, because they have been navigating these spaces for a lot longer than us, and have been able to perhaps do it with more finesse, because they know the space better.
And more awareness, right? Like a deeper, broader awareness. But I think, Hina, the other, so agree, we absolutely need to learn from immigrant Muslims, need to learn from Black Muslims. But I want to just reiterate, we also just need more people doing this work. And I know that it can be really scary, right? Like, I can have the Women's March conversation more easily because I've had some time and distance from it. But like, you say this and I get riled up, because I'm like, someone is out there, right? People are out there saying that we engaged in shirk as though we do that regularly and we did it intentionally. And that is such a heavy allegation. It is, unfortunately, the cost of doing the work is that people, be they right-wing Muslims or right-wing Republicans, will try to attack us. But the more people that do this work, the stronger we are, the more we learn, and the more we can have an influence.
True.
Inshallah.
Well, thank you so, inshallah. So thank you so much for being here and being a part of the show. And, we'll keep this conversation going, inshallah.
Inshallah. Jazakallah khair, Hina.
Okay, inshallah. Thank you, everybody else who is on here. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is going to be voted on the House floor this week. So I urge you all to go to www.justiceforall.org/forced labor and call your House reps, call your congresspeople and tell them to vote yes on the bill. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum.